Welcome in the brand new the commissioner, of the American Athletic Conference, the pride of T-neck Jersey and a former Rutgers tight end, Tim Pernetti. Good morning, my friend. How you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm not doing poorly. I'm really excited that you were able to come do this. And the first thing I want to ask is, when you are...
it's great to hear. I'm more interested in the pain points and understanding where, as a conference, we can think. It's always going to be important. The help the members, because the reality is, bottom line is not a going away. Space in collegiate athletics is generating more and more exposure, and with exposure, more and more revenue. So it's important that we're playing a role on the business side to build a sustainable business rather than what can we do this year? What does the next 10 years look like? So this becomes a conference that institutions want to be part of, and institutions don't need to leave.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we're talking, of course, to Tim Pernetti. He's the new commissioner, the American Athletic Conference, taking over from Mike Oresco, who has been just a tireless supporter of this league. And that's the thing about Mr. Oresco. I know people who like him and people who don't. I think it's hard to not like him if you've met him. But he was tireless in his promotion of this league. What do you take from what he did when he was here?
I'm grateful for Mike. I've known Mike for 20 years, and I worked with him on the media side as a competitor when I was at ABC and he was at CBS for rights. And then when I did CSTV and we were acquired by CBS, I worked very closely with Mike when he ran programming there. Mike is what you described. He is a fierce advocate, and he did an incredible job making sure that this conference stayed in the conversation. And I don't think I can be any more grateful for the foundation that Mike built, because now we get to build on that foundation. If you have to come in and build it, then that's a harder job. If you have to come into something that exists, then you can start to think about how you elevate the enterprise. Like, what swings can you take? Are there conversations in private equity? Do we think about the postseason? Like, what are the creativity points in partnerships and naming and corporate partnerships? And then from there, you really can innovate. Like, not all of those swings are going to hit the ball, but I think some of them have an opportunity to really transform the business. But Mike's done an incredible job. I've had many conversations with him. I'll be going to CFP meetings with him in 2 weeks, and I'm grateful for the hard work he did and the advocacy.
I would imagine so. Tim Pernetti with us, commissioner. Why do I keep saying athletics first? Sorry. Commissioner of the American Athletic Conference. 918-262-5072 is the number if you'd like to text us. Bryce Halls?
Tim, you had comments recently talking about, transfer portal and NIL, and how, there's no way to stop it necessarily when you're talking about these different opportunities that student athletes have, but you would like to, bring in more conference-wide NIL opportunities and ways that you can generate, new resources to provide conference-wide opportunity for these student athletes. Would you be able to elaborate more on what you mean by that?
Sure, Bryce. I guess where my head went originally with this was brands are in hand-to-hand combat as our student athletes, trying to figure out the one-to-one relationships, in NIL. And as I look at it, the top 1% is really the one benefiting from the legislation in NIL, which I'll talk about legislation and its need in a second. But I think there's an opportunity with brands. I think there's an opportunity with the existing brands. Like, there's nothing that says we can't figure out a creative way to increase resources and then provide student athletes the opportunity to also be ambassadors of our brands, to be ambassadors of the conference, be ambassadors of their schools. Like, that is a value exchange. But I do believe brands are looking to attach themselves more broadly to collegiate athletics versus the hand-to-hand combat that's going on right now, one-to-one. So that's what we will explore. And look, quite frankly, I'm getting into this and I'm learning a little bit, but we need federal legislation. This patchwork of state laws that all sort of compete with each other, assuming states even are okay with this. Like, I run the IMG Academy right now. Student athletes there cannot monetize their name, image, and likeness because of state legislation that hasn't been approved. So that in particular is a requirement. And it's not because commissioners and athletic directors want control. This has to do with protecting the interests of young people. Like, NIL is foreign turf. There's not a lot of legislation that is consistent, which means there's risk. And I think a lot of student athletes don't feel or understand the risk around them. Like, we have an obligation to put guardrails in to protect them, not to control them.
And that's the hard part, isn't it? Because we are, as you said, when you say hand-to-hand combat, I hope everybody understands what you're basically talking about is everybody's trying to fight over that 1% or trying to find how they make their thing work. But advertising kind of works that way. If you scatter shoot, you waste money. You've got to find a way to focus on what you're after. So that kind of brings the business side back into it, right?
It does, but think about it in a different way, Rick, is sure, you could go after, Rick Corey, who's got this massive following, and you can provide, a certain payment and get a certain value in exchange. And it is a little narrow because if you look at 7,000 student athletes across an entire conference, and maybe you decide that you're going to approach one or two to do a little bit more because they have a bigger audience. But suddenly you're speaking to a much bigger audience across a much bigger piece of real estate. And this is going to require some selling. But I do think, and I've had some conversations with brands prior to even taking the job confidentially, and I do think that's something that's already resonating. We have to get into the details of how it actually looks, but there is a much broader and bigger megaphone by being part of 7,000 voices versus just 75.
Yeah, no question about that. We had a text here for you that said, listen, with your background, Major League Soccer, as you said, IMG Academy, and being an AD and all those, I'm sure you took a little bit of something from all those, but is any one of those particularly helped prepare you the most for this step?
It's an excellent question. It's a good test. I probably would get a B- at best on this. The thing about it, Rick, is I've taken a little bit from everything, but what I love about what's happening in the commissioner space is, like, these are a lot of my colleagues, like Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti worked across the hall from me when I was at ABC Sports. Brett Yormark and I worked together. I know all the commissioners, and I've worked with all of them in some capacity. I think the one in particular that's going to help me the most is when I worked on a campus, because I did work on a campus for 4 years. When you work on a campus, it's different. And you suddenly now understand the how, the why, and the who that every decision impacts because you see it up close on the front lines. So that in particular, I think, will bring me some great perspective. And then certainly all the business side opportunities, including the latest in being able to be part of something that we built and sold to private equity, really have opened my eyes to the possible.
Yeah, and boy, there's a lot of possible right about now. What do you see as the biggest challenge for this league, especially as we head for what many people believe is coming really quickly, which is a split of the halves?
Well, that's the hard part. And I think that when I met with the presidents and I went through the process, I really got into them about commitment and about what they aspire to be and like where they see things moving. And there is a reality that there seems to be a movement to create a bigger gap and disparity between everyone. And I don't think that's good for the sport, and we're talking mainly here about college football, because I think the commissioners have a responsibility to move the industry forward in a unified way. What's happening now is it seems like it's growing, which is great. There's more opportunities in the postseason, also great, which we have access to, which is important. But it's 12 slots. There's 134 institutions playing Division I football. I think there's room for more. And when I say room for more, it's not let's go to 16 or 24 or 36. There's something new out there that could also be complementary to everything that's going on in the bowls and in the CFP. This thing was built on opportunity for everyone, and I think we're getting away from that. It's becoming more exclusive and not inclusive as it was designed to be.
Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. And that's the problem is so many people, especially in those upper levels that you mentioned, when you're talking about the SEC or the Big Ten, they kind of feel deserving of themselves. Well, we have the bigger stadium, we have the bigger crowds. That's the way it's going to work. How does a school like Rice or a school like Tulsa or a school like UAB who are in your league, how do they compete with that?
It's a challenge. I think our job, all we can control at the conference level is really digging in on some of the innovation and, like I said, these big swings and try to do some things differently to better resource them. I think coaches and administrators and ADs are stressed out from having to deal with all this stuff. Like you're spending time on trying to keep your roster together at the end of the year. You're spending time making sure the NIL is in place for certain, key student athletes. And creating more resources removes stressors from those groups so they can actually get to the job and focus on, like coaches want to recruit and coach football. But now they're getting taken away from the core by needing to do all this stuff. And whether it's whether it's Kevin, in football, or it's Eric in men's basketball, or it's Angie in women's basketball, they're all dealing with the same thing. Like, it doesn't not exist if you don't coach in one of the bigger named conferences. That's just not a reality.
Mm-hmm. You talked about knowing the other commissioners, and we're closing moments here with Tim Pernetti, the American Athletic Conference's brand new commissioner. It's different to be Greg Sankey than it is to be, Mike yourself, or to be Brett Yormark, and it's even different to be Brett Yormark than it is Sankey. These guys are all a little bit different. Brett brings a very different approach to this, as you said, you're bringing some of too. But you've got kind of a mix in there. When you talk to those commissioners, is there one you take more from? And because you're a younger commissioner, a little bit more like Brett, to me, at least just in this first interview, is that kind of a new wave?
I think it is, and I think the business demands it right now. And I think that the responsibility of the role demands it. It's not what it was when I first started working in television on the media side and dealt with Jim Delaney and Commissioner Hansen at the Pac-12 and Commissioner Kramer and Commissioner Swafford. Like, it was different. I'm not saying that they had innovation in mind. Like, think about all the great things they did as a group, the BCS, you can go on and on and on. But I do think the job demands it now more than ever. And I've had conversations with all the commissioners already, or connected with all of them. What's great for me, because, guys, I got to be honest with you, like, I'm pinching myself a little bit being in the CFP room. Like, I've always wondered what goes on in there. I'm actually excited to get in there. But the good news for me is I have pre-existing relationships that go back decades with everybody in the room. And I think that's a great advantage, because then you can just sort of get past everybody's familiar with each other and get on to the business at hand. But I think we all have a responsibility to be transparent with each other. Like, you have to collaborate, and then you're also going to compete at times. And that is the dynamic about collegiate athletics that people absolutely love, the competition.
Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. I guess the last thing is there's so many challenges right now. And in all of sports, we kind of gravitate toward football. This is a football state, unquestionably. We gravitate toward that. But the challenges are so many. How do you realistically, you talk about approaching it head on and those kinds of things, but there's realism out there too, is that those big boys don't always want to play with the little boys. Is there realistically a way to make that work, or do you really believe we're headed for that split?
No, I think there's a realistic way to make things work. Are things ever going to be as equitable as they used to be 20 years ago? I think that's a great question. I think that has challenges all over it. But I think the public thinks one thing, which is it's going to be either one way or it's going to be the other way. And to me, there's a lot of ways in the middle there that can be taken on to change this thing. I think it's going to be hard. I think the more profile and the more money and the more resources that certain are generating over others makes it more challenging. But again, relationships are everything in collegiate athletics. That's my favorite part of the business. And I'm hoping, I think this is the ultimate test of relationships that we've all built with each other over the past 20 years.
Yeah. Well, I apologize. We're a little late to you with OJ yesterday and the Masters and John Smith retiring, which was a huge news here in Oklahoma. It got a little hectic. I'm glad that you were able to take this time. Thanks to Chuck Sullivan again for helping do that. I'm sure we'll catch up with you at American Athletic Conference Media Days and be in touch. Good luck. Congratulations. And I'm sure we'll see you around town.
I look forward to meeting you guys. Thanks for the time. Take care.
That is Tim Pernetti. He is the new conference commissioner of the American